A 6-month-old baby, unable to move his limbs, rested quietly in his crib as he did each night. But when his puppy performed an astonishing act, what followed left everyone speechless. Was this a divine intervention? The home was hushed, save for the gentle buzz of the baby monitor. A dim nightlight bathed the nursery in a soft glow where 6-month-old Elias lay motionless in his crib. His little chest lifted and sank with steady breaths. Yet his legs stayed still, just as they had for months. No kicking, no wiggling toes, no hint of motion. Specialists had informed his parents, Sophie and James, that there was no solution. Elias's paralysis stemmed from an unknown origin with no remedy in sight. Beyond the nursery, Sophie huddled on the couch, clutching a baby blanket unwashed for weeks, its fabric still carrying Elias's newborn scent, a tender echo of the infant who once stretched his legs freely and reached for her with eager hands. Tears brimmed in her eyes as she glanced at James, seated beside her, staring vacantly at the floor. "I don't know how much longer I can endure this," Sophie murmured, her voice so faint it seemed she feared confessing it aloud. "I keep wondering, what if this is permanent? What if he never moves again?" James let out a slow breath, rubbing his face with his hand. "We have to keep believing," he replied, though his tone wavered with doubt. Belief was growing harder to cling to. At their feet, Luna, their golden retriever puppy, raised his head, ears alert, eyes shifting between his owners and the nursery door. He'd always been drawn to Elias, lingering by his crib as if sensing something was amiss. Tonight, however, something shifted. Luna's frame stiffened, his tail motionless. He wasn't merely resting near Elias, he was observing him. Sophie noticed, but dismissed it. "At least he adores Elias," she whispered. "I just wish love could heal him." Unbeknownst to them, love was on the verge of doing something remarkable, something that would leave them stunned, something that would transform their lives forever. The night wore on, silent and oppressive. Sophie and James lingered on the couch, too drained to speak, yet too unsettled to rest. The burden of uncertainty weighed heavily upon them. Every day had morphed into a routine of medical appointments, endless research, and prayers that felt unheard. In the nursery, Elias slept serenely, oblivious to the anguish his parents bore. His small hands lay near his chest, fingers slightly curled, but his legs remained immobile, as they had for months. Luna, the golden retriever puppy, rested beside the crib, his warm brown eyes locked on Elias. He'd been this way for weeks, refusing to stray from the baby's side. Initially, Sophie and James chalked it up to instinct, a sweet connection between a puppy and a child, but recently, Luna's demeanor had shifted. He wasn't just keeping Elias company. He was guarding him, almost as if anticipating something. That night, the anticipation became action. Luna abruptly rose, ears twitching, pacing in tight circles near the crib, glancing at Elias, then the door, then back again. Something unsettled him. His usual tranquility gave way to urgency, a change Sophie and James couldn't yet fathom. Then, without warning, Luna propped his front paws on the crib's edge and emitted a low whimper. He nudged the bars with his nose, then glanced toward the door as if beckoning someone. In the living room, Sophie caught the sound. She sat up, brow creased. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning to James. He nodded, already rising from the couch. "Yeah, it sounded like Luna." They rushed to the nursery, hearts racing, not with dread, but with an unnameable sensation. Reaching the doorway, they saw Luna standing on his hind legs, pressing his nose against the crib's bars. He let out another gentle whimper, his tail wagging faintly. But what seized Sophie's gaze wasn't just Luna's actions, it was Elias. Elias's fingers twitched. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Sophie saw it. Her breath snagged in her throat. "James," she whispered, clutching his arm. "Look at his hand." James's eyes widened. They both stood rooted, watching, and then it happened again, a faint, delicate motion. Elias's fingers curled and uncurled, as if stirred by something invisible. For the first time in months, Sophie felt a flicker of something she'd scarcely dared to embrace: hope. But this was merely the start. Sophie's breath caught as she gripped James's arm tighter, her gaze fixed on Elias's tiny hand. The motion was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was real. For months, they'd watched their son lie still, physicians repeating the same grim prognosis. There was nothing to be done. Yet now, before their eyes, his fingers twitched again, this time with more intent, more clarity, as if something within him was stirring awake. James edged closer to the crib, his voice a hushed murmur. Elias. He reached out, hands trembling, torn between fear of hoping and a desperate need to believe. The baby's eyes stayed shut, his breathing even, his body still, except for that one small motion. Luna let out another soft whimper, pressing his head against the crib as if he sensed the moment's weight. His tail wagged slowly but surely, his presence steadfast. Elias, baby, can you hear us? Sophie knelt beside the crib, brushing her fingers against her son's hand, yearning to feel it herself. Then it happened again. Elias's fingers curled faintly around hers, his grip feeble but unmistakable. A sharp gasp escaped her as she turned to James, tears pooling in her eyes. Did you see that? James nodded, his own eyes wide, his face a mix of shock and overwhelming feeling. I saw it, he whispered, swallowing hard. I saw it. For a moment, the world around them dissolved. The months of despair, the sleepless nights spent seeking answers, the fatigue woven into their daily existence, all faded into the background. Right now, all that mattered was their son, who'd been motionless for so long, was moving. Luna let out a small bark, his excitement mounting. He raised his front paws, gently nudging the crib's bars again, his bright eyes never leaving Elias. It was as if he knew more was coming. And then, just as Sophie was about to summon a doctor, just as James reached for his phone to capture the moment, Elias's entire hand lifted, slow, shaky, but with a strength absent for months. A sob tore from Sophie's throat as she covered her mouth, unable to trust what she saw. James let out a sharp breath, his hands bracing the crib's edge as if to steady himself. Elias's fingers wiggled again, his hand stretching toward Luna, as if he somehow sensed the puppy had been there all along, waiting, watching, never abandoning him. And then, for the first time in months, Elias's legs twitched, barely a shift beneath the blanket. But it was real, it was happening. Everything they'd understood about their son's condition, every word from the doctors, every shard of despair they'd borne for so long, none of it held weight anymore. Because, against all odds, Elias was pushing back, and it had all begun with Luna. James slumped onto the crib's edge, his gaze locked on Elias's tiny legs. The movement was slight, just a faint stir beneath the blanket, but it was undeniable. His mind scrambled to process what they were witnessing. For months, they'd been told their son might never move again, yet here he was, fingers reaching, legs shifting, alive in a way he hadn't been in ages. Sophie pressed her hands over her mouth, shaking her head as if doubting her own eyes. This isn't possible, she whispered, though deep down she longed to believe it was. Luna stood on his hind legs again, tail wagging swiftly now, his excitement palpable. He let out another soft bark, nudging the crib's bars with his nose, his eyes fixed on Elias. It was as if he understood what was unfolding, as if he'd been awaiting this moment all along. And then, as if spurred by the puppy's silent urging, Elias's legs twitched again, this time bolder, more certain. A choked sob broke from Sophie as she sank to her knees beside the crib, reaching to stroke her son's cheek. His skin was warm beneath her touch, his tiny face calm, eyelids fluttering as if he were starting to rouse. James ran a trembling hand through his hair, his voice raw with emotion. We need to call someone, a doctor. Someone needs to see this. But Sophie stayed still, too scared to look away, too terrified that blinking might shatter this moment like a dream. Not yet, she whispered. Just let him keep going. Elias stirred again, this time making a small sound, a faint whimper that sent a fresh surge of hope crashing over them. His fingers curled, his legs shifted, and then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, his eyelids fluttered open. His deep brown eyes blinked up at them, brimming with sleepy innocence, unaware of the miracle he embodied. And then, as if pulled by something unseen, his gaze drifted toward Luna. The puppy wagged his tail, letting out a joyful little bark, and that was when it happened. Elias, whose arms had been weak for months, whose doctors had said his body might never regain motion, lifted his hand and reached for Luna. Sophie let out a sob so fierce it shook her entire frame. James turned away, rubbing his hands over his face as if to anchor himself, but the tears in his eyes were undeniable. Elias's tiny fingers brushed Luna's fur, and the puppy leaned into the touch, pressing his head against the baby's hand. In that instant, something shifted within Sophie and James. For the first time in months, they weren't sinking in helplessness, weren't ensnared by the fear of what they might lose. For the first time, they felt something else. They felt hope. Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she watched her son's delicate fingers tangle in Luna's fur. The warmth of the puppy's coat against his skin, the way Elias clung on, weak but resolute, was something she'd prayed for, something she'd dreamed of but never dared believe could happen. James knelt beside her, his breath uneven. He reached for Elias's leg, hesitating, afraid to hope too much, but when his fingers grazed his son's tiny knee, he felt it, a small but certain twitch. His hands shook as he looked up at Sophie, his voice thick with emotion. "He's moving, Liv. He's really moving." Elias blinked up at them, his deep brown eyes filled with the same innocence and curiosity they'd once known. He wasn't just reacting to them. He was reaching, feeling, fighting. He was awakening. Luna let out an eager bark, circling the crib before planting his paws on the bars again, his tail wagging so fast it blurred. It was as if he grasped what was occurring, as if he knew he'd been waiting for this all along. James let out a shaky laugh, wiping his face. How is this even possible? Sophie had no answer. All she knew was that for months, they'd been submerged in helplessness, trapped in a reality where their son's future seemed to slip away. They'd held on to hope, but it had felt unattainable. And now, here they were, witnessing something that defied all they'd been told. She leaned forward, brushing her fingers across Elias's cheek. "You're so strong, baby," she whispered. "You're so strong." Elias let out a soft coo, and as if her words touched something deep within him, his legs shifted again, not just a twitch this time, a real, unmistakable movement. James let out a sharp breath, his hands gripping the crib as this is a miracle, he whispered, and deep down, Sophie knew it was. The days that followed brimmed with emotions they hadn't felt in ages. Hope, relief, gratitude. Each morning, Elias showed a bit more movement, his muscles gradually recalling what they'd forgotten. His fingers gripped firmer, his legs kicked gently beneath his blanket. His doctors were baffled, calling it an inexplicable recovery, something they'd never anticipated. But Sophie and James knew the truth. It wasn't just a medical enigma. It wasn't mere chance. It was love embodied in a small golden retriever puppy who never left Elias's side. Love that permeated the home even in its bleakest hours. Love that reminded them miracles don't always arrive in grand, abrupt moments. They unfold in the smallest, quietest ways. One tiny twitch, one gentle nudge, one soft paw against the crib. Luna had never stopped believing in Elias, even when the world urged them to surrender. And somehow, in a way no one could explain, that love had sufficed. As Sophie sat in the rocking chair, cradling Elias in her arms, she looked down at Luna, nestled beside them. She reached out, running her fingers through his soft fur. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice laden with emotion. Luna simply let out a soft sigh, nuzzling closer, as if he already knew. In that moment, Sophie realized something. Sometimes miracles don't come as we expect. They don't stem from doctors or medicine or things we can comprehend. Sometimes miracles come in the form of love, and sometimes they have 4 legs and a wagging tail. No matter what struggles you face, no matter how bleak things appear, never stop believing in love, in kindness, and in the surprising ways life can astonish you. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, the quietest acts of love, bring the greatest miracles. Hold on to hope, for miracles emerge in the most unforeseen ways. Elias's tiny fingers curled deeper into Luna's fur, weak but real, and Sophie's breath caught in her throat as a sob trembled past her lips. James gripped the crib's railing, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. Their son, who had spent months lying motionless, unresponsive, paralyzed, was moving. It wasn't much, just the faintest twitch of his fingers, the smallest shift of his tiny hand, but it was enough to send a shock wave through them. Luna let out a soft whimper, her tail wagging in fast, eager bursts, her body vibrating with an excitement she had been holding in for far too long. It was as if she had known, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if she had never doubted for a second that it would come. James swallowed, his voice barely more than a whisper, raw with disbelief. "Did you see that?" Sophie could only nod, her hands trembling as she clutched the crib's railing like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Then Elias's hand twitched again. James sucked in a sharp breath, his pulse hammering as he looked down at his son's tiny legs, still hidden beneath the soft baby blanket. His body screamed at him to stay still, to not hope, to not believe that this was real, but his heart wouldn't listen. Hesitantly, his shaking fingers reached forward, gripping the edge of the blanket, his stomach twisting into knots as he prepared himself for disappointment. But just as he was about to lift the fabric, just as he braced for stillness, Elias's leg twitched. It was barely a movement, just the faintest tremor beneath the blanket, but James felt it, saw it, knew it was real. Sophie gasped so sharply it almost sounded like a sob, her hands flying to her mouth, her entire body shaking as tears flooded her vision. "James," she choked out, gripping his arms so tightly he could feel her nails digging into his skin. But he didn't care. Their son had moved. After months of doctors shaking their heads, of therapists telling them not to expect progress, of sleepless nights spent searching for answers that never came, Elias had moved. Luna let out a small, eager bark, hopping onto her hind legs, her front paws pressing against the crib's railing as she let out another urgent whimper. It was like she was encouraging Elias, like she was telling him to keep going, like she had been waiting for this and wasn't about to let it stop now. James's breath came out in uneven gasps, his mind still struggling to keep up, but then it happened again. This time there was no mistaking it, no chance that it was a coincidence or a trick of the light. Elias's tiny foot, hidden beneath the soft cotton blanket, shifted. Sophie let out a strangled cry, her knees giving out as she sank onto the floor beside the crib, her fingers gripping the mattress as if holding onto it would somehow make this moment more real. James pressed his fist against his mouth, his whole body tense with the weight of what he was seeing, but Elias wasn't done. His fingers wiggled again, this time more deliberate, more certain, and then, slowly, shakily, he lifted his entire hand off the mattress. Luna barked again, tail wagging so fast it was a blur, her bright, eager eyes never leaving Elias's face. She knew, she had always known. James's hands trembled as he reached toward his son, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Elias, baby, can you hear me?" Elias blinked up at them, his deep brown eyes full of sleepy innocence, completely unaware of the miracle that had just taken place, completely unaware that his parents were falling apart, breaking in the best possible way because, against all odds, against everything they had been told, he was fighting his way back. Luna whined again, pressing her nose against the crib bars, her body practically vibrating with excitement. And as if Elias had been waiting for that final push, as if he knew his best friend was cheering him on, his tiny fingers stretched forward, reaching toward the golden fur he had felt by his side for so many months. And then, just like that, Elias moved again. This time it wasn't just his hand. His leg kicked, weak, trembling, uncertain, but real. James let out a sharp breath, gripping Sophie's shoulders as he pulled her back up, but neither of them could take their eyes off their son. Their boy, their miracle, their Elias was moving. Sophie sobbed into James's chest, her whole body trembling as she clung to him. But he couldn't even bring himself to comfort her, couldn't do anything but stare at the crib, at Elias, at Luna, at the undeniable proof that their son was waking up. James swallowed hard, his voice barely there, but so full of something he hadn't felt in months. "We need to call someone, a doctor. Someone has to see this." Sophie didn't move, she didn't even blink. She was too afraid to look away, too terrified that if she did, if she let this moment go, it would disappear like a dream. "Not yet," she whispered, shaking her head, her eyes never leaving Elias's tiny, moving hands. "Just let him keep going." Because, for the first time in months, hope wasn't just a word. It was real, and it was happening right in front of them. Elias's fingers twitched again, this time stronger, more certain, and James couldn't breathe. He was afraid to move, afraid to blink, afraid that if he did, the moment would slip through his fingers like sand. Sophie clung to his arm, her fingers digging into his skin, her chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. She was crying, silent tears streaming down her face, but she wasn't sobbing. No, this wasn't sadness, this was something else. Luna let out another soft bark, the excitement practically radiating off her as she pressed her paws against the crib, her nose twitching, her tail wagging in wild, eager bursts. She knew. She had always known. And now, Elias knew too. James swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. Elias, baby, can you do it again? Elias blinked slowly, his deep brown eyes flickering between his parents and the little golden retriever that had never left his side. For months, he had lain there, still, silent, trapped in a body that wouldn't listen to him. But tonight, something was different. Something was waking up. Luna let out another encouraging whimper, and then Elias moved again, his tiny hand stretched forward, fingers reaching, shaking but reaching. His muscles trembled and used to the effort, but he didn't stop. He kept going, reaching for Luna, for the warmth and comfort that had been beside him every night. Sophie gasped as she saw it, the faintest hint of determination in her baby's eyes. James ran a shaking hand through his hair, letting out a short, disbelieving laugh. Soft, he's trying. Sophie nodded quickly, wiping the tears from her cheeks, her lips trembling as she reached out, her fingers hovering just above Elias's tiny leg. Come on, baby, she whispered. Show us. For a second, nothing happened. The air in the room was so still it felt like time itself had stopped. The weight of months of helplessness, of unanswered prayers, of crushing heartbreak, it all hung in the silence, heavy and suffocating. And then, Elias's leg kicked. It was weak, barely a movement, but it was real, real. Sophie let out a strangled sob, her hands flying to her mouth as her whole body trembled. James stumbled back a step, gripping the edge of the crib for balance, his chest heaving, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break right out of him. Elias wasn't done. His leg twitched again, then his toes curled slightly beneath the blanket. Then, in a moment that shattered everything they thought they knew, his other leg moved too. James exhaled a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside him for months. Sophie was shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing, as if she was afraid this was some cruel dream and she'd wake up to find her baby still trapped in stillness. Luna, overcome with excitement, barked again, hopping on her paws before pressing her head against the crib's bars, and Elias, who had never once responded to Luna's presence before, smiled. It was small, just the faintest lift of his lips, barely noticeable through the blur of tears in Sophie's eyes, but it was there. James let out a choked laugh, wiping his face with the back of his hand. Did you see that? His voice was raw, full of something he hadn't felt in so long. Hope. Sophie nodded frantically, still crying, still trembling, still unable to look away from the son she thought she had lost. I saw it, she whispered. I saw it. She reached for Elias, her fingers barely brushing against his tiny leg, and he moved toward her touch. It wasn't much, just a tiny shift, the smallest instinctive reaction, but it sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over them. James let out a shaky breath, running a hand over his face as he tried to make sense of the impossible. We need to call someone, a doctor. Someone has to see this. But Sophie wasn't ready, not yet. She shook her head, still watching Elias's tiny movements like they were the most precious thing she'd ever seen. Just wait, she whispered, just a little longer. Because, in this moment, in this quiet nursery filled with love, warmth, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog, nothing else mattered. Not the doctors, not the diagnosis, not the months of uncertainty. Right now, Elias was moving, and against all odds, against everything they had been told, he wasn't stopping. Elias's tiny fingers twitched again, his hand shaking from the effort, but he didn't stop. Sophie watched in breathless silence, tears streaming down her face, her hands clutched over her chest, as if she could somehow hold in the overwhelming emotion threatening to spill over. James gripped the crib railing so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind racing, his heart hammering in his chest. They weren't imagining it. This wasn't a dream. Elias was moving. Luna let out another excited bark, her paws pressing against the crib's bars as her tail wagged uncontrollably. She whined, shifting on her paws, her bright, eager eyes locked on the baby she had refused to give up on. It was as if she knew this was only the beginning, and she was right. Elias's fingers stretched again, weak and shaky but reaching. His tiny hand hovered over the crib mattress, trembling with the effort, and then, for the first time in months, he lifted his arm. It wasn't much, just a few inches, just long enough for his fingers to brush against Luna's fur, but it was enough. Sophie let out a choked sob, falling to her knees beside the crib, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth. James took a shaky step back, running both hands through his hair, his breath coming in uneven gasps. His mind couldn't keep up with what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't possible, it couldn't be, but there Elias was, defying everything they had been told. Luna barked again, letting out a soft whimper as she nuzzled her head against Elias's outstretched fingers. She didn't pull away, she stayed still, waiting, letting Elias feel her. And Elias, who had never responded to anyone's touch, who had spent months lying still, frozen in his tiny crib, smiled. James felt his legs go weak. He reached for Sophie, gripping her shoulder, needing to hold on to something solid, because everything about this moment felt impossible. Sophie turned her tear-streaked face toward him, her lips trembling, her whole body shaking with the weight of it all. "James," she whispered, barely able to form the words. He knows. He knows it's Luna." James couldn't speak, he could barely breathe. Elias's hand, still small and delicate, curled into Luna's fur, gripping it the way he used to hold on to Sophie's fingers before the paralysis took over. His touch was light, unsteady, but it was there, and then his legs twitched again. James let out a strangled breath, gripping the back of his neck, his entire body trembling. This doesn't make sense," he whispered, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears, like it belonged to someone else. "The doctors said. They said he'd never. They were wrong," Sophie breathed, her voice thick with tears. "Oh my God, James, they were wrong." Elias let out a tiny, soft coo, his deep brown eyes flickering between his parents and the golden retriever who had never left his side. His fingers, still wrapped in Luna's fur, squeezed, a small, weak grip, but a grip nonetheless. Luna let out another soft, happy whimper, her tail wagging even faster, her paws scratching eagerly at the crib as if urging Elias on. "Keep going, don't stop now." And then, as if he understood, Elias kicked, not just a twitch this time, a full, small, but undeniable movement of his leg. Sophie let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, her hands flying to cover her face as she crumpled against James's chest. James wrapped his arms around her instinctively, but his eyes never left Elias. "He's doing it," he whispered, his voice raw, his heart pounding. "Soft, he's really doing it." Elias kicked again, then, before their eyes, he lifted his foot off the mattress. James let out a breathless laugh, running his hands over his face in disbelief. "Holy!" His voice broke before he could finish the sentence. He turned toward Sophie, his expression filled with something he hadn't dared to feel in months, pure, unshakable hope. Luna barked, circling excitedly before leaping up against the crib again, as if encouraging Elias to keep going, to keep fighting. And Elias, their perfect, strong little boy, smiled again, a real, bright, undeniable smile. For the first time in months, their baby wasn't just existing. He was waking up, and nothing would ever be the same again. Elias's tiny foot lifted again, shaking, uncertain, but undeniably moving. Sophie let out another sob, one that shook her whole body, her hands covering her mouth as she stared at her son. James had to grip the edge of the crib just to stay standing, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. Luna let out another excited bark, tail wagging so fast it was a blur. She wasn't just watching anymore, she was encouraging. She pressed her nose against Elias's hand again, waiting, urging, as if she knew this wasn't over yet, and she was right, because Elias wasn't stopping. His tiny fingers curled tighter around the golden fur, his grip still weak, but stronger than before. His little face, once so still and expressionless, was now filled with something new, something Sophie hadn't seen in months, determination. James exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face, his body trembling. Soft, do you see this? Do you see him? His voice was raw, thick with disbelief, with something close to fear. Fear that this was too good to be true. But Sophie wasn't afraid, not anymore. She reached forward, brushing her fingers against Elias's leg, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her touch, waiting to see if it would happen again. And then it did. Elias's leg shifted beneath the blanket, his tiny toes wiggling in response. He felt her. He was reacting. He was fighting. Sophie let out a trembling breath, tears still falling down her cheeks as she turned to James. He knows we're here, she whispered, her voice breaking. He can feel us. James swallowed hard, nodding quickly, his own eyes glassy. Yeah, he whispered. Yeah, he can. Luna whined softly, shifting on her paws, her eyes never leaving Elias's face, and then Elias turned his head, slowly, carefully, but deliberately. He was looking for Luna. James let out a strangled laugh, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. No way, he whispered. No way. But it was happening. Elias's gaze locked onto the little golden retriever, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, as if his body was just now remembering how to react, how to feel, how to come back to them. And then, before either of them could process it, Elias did something that shattered every doubt, every moment of fear, every whisper of hopelessness that had filled their lives for months. He reached for Luna. Not a twitch, not an accident, not just the smallest movement. He lifted his arm, weak but deliberate, and reached. Luna let out a joyful bark, pressing herself against the crib, licking Elias's tiny fingers the moment they touched her fur. Elias giggled, a tiny, soft, beautiful sound, one that Sophie hadn't heard in so long she almost forgot what it sounded like. She collapsed against James, sobbing into his chest, gripping his shirt like she was afraid to let go. Oh my God, James, she gasped. He's really here. James's hands were shaking as he held her close, his breath unsteady. I know, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I know. Luna let out an excited bark, jumping in place, her paws scratching at the floor as she wagged her tail, so hard her whole body moved with it. And Elias, their son, their miracle, their little fighter, laughed. Not a small chuckle, not just a faint sound, a real, full, joyous baby laugh. And in that moment, Sophie and James knew this was just the beginning. Elias's laughter filled the room, soft and sweet, a sound they hadn't heard in so long it almost felt foreign. Sophie pressed a trembling hand to her lips, her breath hitching as more tears spilled down her cheeks. James couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at his son in utter disbelief. Luna was still pressed against the crib, her tail wagging wildly, her bright golden fur glowing in the soft nursery light. She let out another small bark, and Elias responded, his tiny fingers gripping onto the puppy's fur again. But this time it wasn't weak, wasn't unsure. This time, there was strength in his touch, determination in the way he held on. James's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer, his hands still shaking, his mind still racing to understand what was happening. Just hours ago, Elias had been exactly as he had been for months, still, lifeless, unresponsive. But now, before his very eyes, his little boy was moving, laughing, reaching, fighting. Sophie reached out, her finger brushing over Elias's leg again. And this time he didn't just twitch. He kicked, a real, undeniable movement. Her breath caught in her throat, a sob choking her as she turned to James, her whole body trembling. He's moving, she whispered, barely able to get the words out. James, he's really moving. James let out a shaky breath, a disbelieving laugh escaping his lips as he wiped a hand down his face. I see him, he whispered. God, soft, I see him. His voice cracked, the weight of months of helplessness crashing over him all at once. But this time it wasn't despair that filled his chest. It was something else, something lighter, something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Elias cooed, his tiny fingers still curled into Luna's fur, his little body squirming for the first time in what felt like forever. His legs kicked again, weak but real, and Sophie let out another strangled sob, reaching for him, needing to feel him, needing to know this was real. She brushed her fingers across his cheek, her voice breaking. "Baby, you're so strong," she whispered. "You're so strong." Elias blinked up at her, his big brown eyes full of sleepy innocence, unaware of the miracle he was at the center of. But Sophie and James knew. They knew this moment was impossible, unexplainable, something that should have never happened. They had spent so many nights wondering if they would ever see their son move again, praying for something, anything, to bring him back to them. And now, against every single odd, he was fighting his way back. Luna let out a soft whine, resting her head against the crib, her tail still wagging, her warm brown eyes locked onto Elias as if she understood just how much this moment meant. And maybe, in some way, she did. Maybe she had always known. Maybe that's why she never left Elias's side, why she had always stayed close, always waited, always believed. James let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head, his throat so tight he could barely get the words out. "Soph," he whispered. "We need to call someone. The doctors, they need to see this." But Sophie didn't move. She couldn't. She was too afraid to break the moment, too afraid to let go, too afraid that if she did, if she turned away even for a second, this miracle would disappear like a dream. She shook her head slowly, her fingers still stroking Elias's tiny hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet," she murmured. "Just a little longer." Because, for the first time in months, their house wasn't filled with silence. It wasn't filled with fear or helplessness or the weight of the unknown. It was filled with the sound of their son's laughter, and that was all that mattered. The days that followed were a blur of shock, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. Sophie and James called every doctor they had ever spoken to, desperate for answers, but none of them had one. There was no medical reason for what had happened, no explanation for how a baby who had been paralyzed for months could suddenly begin to move again. They ran tests, scans, evaluations, but the results were always the same. Elias was recovering, slowly, steadily, but undeniably. The doctors called it an unexplainable phenomenon, a rare, spontaneous event that defied logic. But Sophie and James knew the truth. It wasn't just science, it wasn't just luck, it was love. Love that had come in the form of a tiny golden retriever who had never left their son's side. Love that had filled their home even in its darkest moments. Love that had refused to give up, refused to accept what the world told them was impossible. And somehow, in a way no one could explain, that love had been enough. One night, as Sophie sat in the rocking chair, holding Elias against her chest, she looked down at Luna, curled up at her feet. She reached out, running her fingers through her soft golden fur, her eyes filling with tears. "You saved him," she whispered. Luna lifted her head, looking at her with those same deep, knowing eyes, and in that moment, Sophie realized something. Sometimes miracles don't come the way we expect them to. They don't always come from doctors or medicine or things we can understand. Sometimes miracles come in the smallest, quietest ways. Sometimes they come with 4 legs and a wagging tail. No matter what struggles you're facing, no matter how hopeless things may seem, never stop believing in love, in kindness, in the unexpected ways life can surprise you. Because sometimes, the smallest gestures, the quietest forms of love, bring the biggest miracles.